First time I ever tried to write this down. First time telling anyone outside the family. I'm leaving out time and location and some other details because I'm still scared of what might happen with it publicly, I guess. Summer before 8th grade, me and two of my friends snuck out at midnight to go walk around the neighborhood and go see those girls on the next block who were having a sleepover. We turn a corner in our neighborhood and there's this huge black blimp-shaped thing in the sky. Like the pictures of Hindenburg, but bigger than that, and as close if not closer. Completely silent and the size of at least 4 to 5 football fields across. No exaggeration. Even though I was young, we stared at it entranced, asking each other over and over again if we see it, which we all agree that we do. Standing there, frozen in one place. It's like black polished gunmetal. No lights, no sound, no anything. It's just hovering there. And then, I don't know what happened, but time clearly jumps. Next thing I remember is the craft, ship, government experiment, whatever the hell it was gone. And there's a tiny glowing white barbell thing in the sky, seemingly slowly falling to earth with wisps of smoke coming out of it. The two brand new black trucks with silver gearboxes on the back, like F-150s or S-10s, but nicer, came speeding down the street going about 70 in a residential neighborhood. Then after that, I remember walking home to one of my friend's house and going to bed. At that point, it was like 5 or 6 a.m. and the sun was coming up. We all made a promise to tell my dad in the morning because he worked for the city, but we never did. I don't know what happened later in life to one of my friends who was there, but the other was my best friend, and we sort of made an unspoken pact never to talk about it. Don't know how or why we did that. We all grew up and I sort of lost touch with him too. We did reconnect over Facebook and such over the years, but it was like there was something between us. Neither of us wanted to touch or talk about it. Looking back on it now, there's no way we could have been the only ones to see it. It wasn't that late at night and it was over a heavily populated suburb of a major city. The idea of this has always scared me more than any sorts of possible abduction scenario. That there were others and we're all voluntarily suffering a sort of collective amnesia. Except in how we're not. I've thought about hypnosis, but they scare me, plus I'm not sure if I trust the results. I was just a kid then, and I'm not sure if I could trust a hypnotist. What I do know, again, is that there's no way it was just the three of us who saw it. We're talking a huge thing hovering in the sky directly above hundreds of houses just after midnight on a summer weekend night. But nothing on the news, nothing in the paper, nothing on TV, no words spoken about it again, ever, by anyone. My mom tells a story of her friend, let's call her Lisa. When my mom and Lisa were teenagers, they were on the roof of Lisa's house. They saw a bright light in the sky. Next thing they know, the light's gone. Thing is, they think they've been on the roof for 15 minutes, but something like 3 hours passed. Mom doesn't have any remembering about what happened during that time, and Lisa simply refuses to talk about it. She would answer my mom with things like, I don't know, and just drop it, for a long time. So a couple months later, my mom moves away and loses contact with Lisa for about 10 years. She finally meets up with her again and immediately notices that something's odd about Lisa. Lisa appeared very distant to her with a very dreamy demeanor, like she was really happy and at peace, for no good reason. After they talk for a bit, Lisa brings up the incident on the roof. Mom says she still doesn't really remember anything about it, but Lisa does remember. She remembers everything. She said that at first, it was all bits and pieces and she couldn't remember any of it clearly. She was confused and scared and wanted to avoid discussing it. Then, as time passed, she began to remember more of it. She remembers it all very clearly, and she remembers the other 3 times she was abducted after that clearly as well. At first, they paralyzed her somehow and did all sorts of invasive experiments on her, but by most the recent time, they stopped probing her and began to talk with her. They did not speak English or any other human language, but she could understand everything they said. even though she couldn't speak their language herself. Apparently, they told her all sorts of things, stuff about space, Earth itself, and most shockingly, predicted years beforehand that she would get pregnant in a specific year and it would also be a stillborn, and that she will never be able to have children again. They also told her it was not their fault and they even made an attempt to save her from this fate, but they were unsuccessful. They also told her they abducted my mother, another time after the first incident. Mom says she has no recollection of any of the potential abductions, but she does have recurring nightmares of being abducted, but she's almost sure that they're just that, nightmares. Anyway, Lisa tells Mom that every time she speaks with him, she comes to understand the truth more and more. When Mom inquires what truth is this, Lisa, she just says, "You will know eventually." And she says that once she's learned the truth, then everything became wonderful. Mom has seen her a few more times over the years. We still live in another state from her, and she apparently has a pretty normal life and doesn't obsess over alien stuff. She only ever brings it up in passing, not like it's an essential part of her daily life. I can't say for sure what happened that night, but here's what I do know. I was driving home from the weekend from a school at Indiana University. It takes me about 2 hours to get home, and I left Bloomington around 10 p.m. At exactly 10:53, I'm on a rural stretch of the 2-lane highway I take home, and I notice what appeared to be flashing lights behind me. I thought, great, I'm getting pulled over. So I turned onto the next country road about a quarter mile from where I noticed the lights. As the car came to a stop, I started to open my glove box and get my registration and proof of insurance. The lights suddenly disappeared. No car drove past. Now here's where the story takes a turn for the weird. And I'm sure you guys will think I'm just making it all up, because it really does seem like something straight out of a typical UFO movie or story. The electronics in my car started to go haywire. The radio randomly changing stations while the volume kept going up and down, while the dome lights and headlights start to flicker and turn off and back on. This was at 10:56 p.m. I start thinking at myself, the battery must be failing, or I have a short somewhere in the electric system of my car. So I lean down to pop the hood so I can take a look at the battery, and that's the last thing I remember. The next thing I know, I open my eyes and I see nothing but the night sky full of bright stars. It was a cold night, and it seemed like I have never seen stars that bright in my life. I sat up and looked around, and I saw absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. I was in the middle of a field surrounded by corn stalks left over from the recent harvest. As I started to come to my senses, I started to freak out. Where am I? Why the duck am I asleep in the middle of a field? Where the heck's my car? I got up and started walking toward the distant headlight I could see from the road about a half-mile away. When I got to the nearest intersection, I looked up at the sign which read 350 North and 50 West. I was a half-mile away from my car, which was just right off the main road. I started walking toward the headlights I could see on the main road. I can't say how long it took me to walk the half-mile, but it couldn't have been more than 10 or 15 minutes. When I arrived at the car, all the lights were out. My battery died, which struck me as odd because I couldn't have been gone that long. I looked at my phone, which was sitting on the passenger seat, and the time said 2:17 a.m. Over 3 hours had passed since I turned off onto the side road for the flashing lights behind me. I remember sitting in my car completely dumbfounded, wondering what the hell just happened to me. About a half of an hour just sitting there, I remembered that my battery was dead. So I got on the phone and called AAA to come out and give me a jump. It took about an hour for them to get out to me since I was a good distance away from the nearest town, during which time I just sat, silence running through the possible scenarios in my head concerning what just happened. To this day, I couldn't tell you what really happened to me that night. All I know is I can think of any possible explanation as to why I woke up a half a mile away from my car in the middle of a cornfield more than 3 hours after I stopped. I've only shared this story with one person, my uncle. I'm sure people would either look at me like I'm crazy or they would call bullcrap on the whole story. I can't blame them. If somebody came to me with a story like that so closely mirrors the stereotypical encounter story, I probably wouldn't believe them either. Not my story, but my dad's. As a consequence of this not being my story, I can't insist that, quote, I know what I saw, and all that. All I can tell you is what I believe, him, and he has no reason to lie to me. My dad has over a dozen stories like this. He grew up in the rural Illinois near a woodsy area. UFO activity was apparently high back then. I don't know if it was just my family or the whole area, but my dad and my grandpa would sit on the porch and watch lights fly around their house for fun. This was a long time ago. When my dad was a kid, he's in his 60s now, they would watch the stars dart around like laser lights and laugh about it. It's mind-boggling to me now. I've only seen that kind of thing happen once or twice and it freaked me out. Besides that, a bunch of other weird stuff would happen to my dad. Some of it's pretty similar to the stuff described in this thread. Actually, isolated earthquakes in Illinois that nobody else felt. Bright orbs floating around in the sky and following him around, etc. It's been a while since he told me these stories, but one of them particularly was weird, and it always stuck with me. For your information, I'm completely aware that it sounds like my dad was just ducking with me. And trust me, I'd prefer to believe that. But I have good reasons to trust him, for starters. He's never lied to me about anything else. He wasn't the type of person to make stuff up for show. He also had absolutely nothing to gain from making this up. He never tried to publish it or even write it down. He would just talk about it, sometimes. Anyway, so my dad was in his teens and weird UFO stuff has been happening his whole life at this point. He's out in his driveway for whatever reason, doing whatever people do when they live in a woodsy rural area. His parents are not home. They're out shopping and at work, whatever. Suddenly, this big black car pulls into the driveway, tinted windows, completely black. My dad just kind of watches it pulls in, not sure what to think. Something to remember here, not only is this a rural area, but it's 50 years ago. People were a lot more trusting back then. Nowadays, you'd be crazy to leave your front door unlocked, but back then it was no big deal. So, this strange car pulls up to my dad's driveway. It's making no noise at all, which my dad did not notice right away. The door opens and out steps a super tall, fair-faced white man. He has blonde hair, an extremely well-tailored black suit, black sunglasses. Right away, my dad could see there was something off about him. He looks too perfect. Flawless skin, a childlike smile, and very overdressed for a hot summer day. He looks distinctly out of place. The man walks up to my dad and asks for his name. My dad, who's around 15 at the time, asks him why he wants to know. The man smiles and explains that he just wants to ask him a few questions and he means no harm. Bemused, my dad agrees, but he's still very weary of this strange man. First, the tall white dude asks my dad if he lives here. My dad says yes and asks why he wants to know. The man has a completely relaxed, non-confrontational tone and seems almost giddy, like he was really excited to be having this conversation. His childish, overzealous grin hadn't faded the least. He asked my dad if he ever seen, felt, or heard anything that he felt was outside of the ordinary. My dad said sometimes, and again asked why he wanted to know. The man just kept grinning, and by now, my dad was feeling pretty uncomfortable. He had never seen this guy before in his life. He did not appear to be any kind of government agent. His behavior was far too unusual. Suddenly, the man's demeanor completely changes. His grin disappears and he looks worried. Without so much as a goodbye, he opens his car door, gets inside, and drives away, still making no noise at all. A couple minutes later, my dad's parents come back from shopping. Now, the really weird part. My mom saw the same guy 30 Years later. She was in the bookstore to buy something, I don't know the details, when she turned around and noticed this tall, fair-looking blonde guy in a black suit sitting at a table in a cafe 30 feet or so from my mom. He was reading a newspaper. Sitting across from him was another dude, dressed exactly the same as the blonde one. They still looked strangely out of place, somehow too perfect, too clean. Now, my mom had heard this story from my dad before, and she actually recognized my dad's description of this man. He stood out. So she's kind of taken aback, trying to figure out if it's actually the man my dad had seen all these years back. The blonde guy notices my mom looking at him again. His demeanor completely changes. He stands up, turns around, and quickly walks out of the bookstore with the second guy right behind him. What the heck? I'm actually freaking out a bit thinking about this. I'm 22 now, and I have to wonder if I'm going to run into this awkward blonde stalker. It's like the MIB sent their most inept agent to follow around my dad, or the most obvious alien ever is trying to study my family in our natural habitat. I don't know. I know this is all very vague. I'm going to bring it up to my dad tonight and try to clarify a few details. I'll be honest, I've pushed this story out my head because it weirds me out. Okay, here it goes. The first time I've ever seen anything, I was 7 in Houston. I used to like to climb on top of my mom's Suburban in the driveway and stare at the stars. One night, I saw an intensely bright floating light over the tree line probably about a half-mile away. I hollered, but nobody came to see it. I did not see anything else until March of 2008. This experience happened between the 10th and the 15th. But I can't give a specific date because I was up for 4 days trying to come up with an explanation to satisfy what I've seen. This happened in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. My mother lived in a garden home community, all houses the same size, all one story, and you had great visibility distance-wise. I walked out of my buddy's place at exactly 4 a.m. to a bright starry night. When I walked out, something caught my eye to the left of me. I looked over and saw a bright blue, yellow, green, white, red, orange strobing flashlight floating silently to the left. I stood in awe at it and did not want to go grab anyone because I did not want to miss a thing. I watched as it passed in front of the moon behind my friend's place. I saw the outline of the craft. It was a teardrop, sunflower seed type shape, and the craft seemed to have the lights being transmitted from the top half of it. It was almost as if it was transmitting some type of light pattern upward. It also had a dark, thin, smooth line of exhaust that disappeared 50 to 75 feet behind it. This all occurred no less than 400 yards from me. After it passed the moon, I ran inside and grabbed someone. He saw it, but it was too far away to make out what it was. I went home, which was only a few blocks away, and looked out from the driveway the same direction the first craft had come from. I saw 2 dim white lights slowly coming over the horizon at a slow pace heading towards me. I ran inside and grabbed my mother out of bed. We stood there for about 20 minutes while 5 separate crafts flew over us. First came 2, then 1. About 6 to 7 minutes apart from each other, maybe 20 miles per hour, maybe 200 feet up, completely silent. The way that they looked from underneath was each one had 2 huge bright white lights, which were maybe 30 to 40 feet across, and they were so bright, it was hard to get a good estimate. They also had a pulsating red one between the white lights and a dimmed relit. I would estimate from the size of the white lights that each craft was 100 to 200 feet wide. The last craft that flew over us flew over lower and slower than the first 4 had. It made a noise. It let out a sound that to this day haunts me. It was a roaring noise, followed immediately by a different sound. It was 50 times louder than what I've ever heard. The craft did that twice. These crafts flew directly over us, and I believe the sound was an acknowledgement. Whatever was piloting it knew we were watching it, kind of like a hello. I immediately started crying. I had no idea what I was looking at or what I just heard. The second big experience I had was a couple weeks later. I was standing in my driveway smoking a cigarette listening to my iPad somewhere around 2 a.m. I decided to pause my iPad to turn on the backlight, waved my hand over it a couple times, making somewhat of a strobe pattern. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything come up, but I got that being watched feeling. I looked up, and directly above me was a trapezoid-shaped craft with round edges that had a dark red and black pulsating glowing outline. It was like flowing electricity. It was not even 75 feet up. I could have hit this thing with a rock. I stood there while it hovered directly above me, completely silent for maybe 10 to 15 seconds, while it made this kind of motion similar to the ball that Luke trained with in Star Wars. It hovered side to side, front to back in a smooth motion, never getting more than 20 feet away from its original position. It was extremely fascinating. I stood there frozen stiff. After those few seconds, I waved one hand at a friendly manner. It then changed light pattern and hovered away behind my house. Upon deeper inspection, the fact that it knew I saw it, made no effort to evade my detection, makes me think it wanted me to follow it. Although, I was too freaked out to think about it at the time. I've seen that same aircraft on 3 different occasions. Once again in Tuscaloosa, once in Hoover, and once in Bessemer. The time I saw it in Hoover was at an apartment complex at the top of a huge hill with a great overlook. It was nighttime and I was with friends. Over the overlook, I saw a gray craft facing my direction that looked similar to Hoth Fighter. Forgive the Star Wars references. And as soon as I saw it, it took off to the right silently, extremely quick. The time in Bessemer and Tuscaloosa, the trapezoid shape appeared in the sky solid white, stretched to twice its length, then the bottom shot up to the front like it hit light speed or something. I do frequently see what I like to call streaks. They look like shooting stars, only very low, move slower, but they still have tails and streams behind them. They can also appear in many different colors. One strange story is one night when I had a dream in Tuscaloosa. In the dream, I couldn't see or hear anything, but I could feel things. I was laying on something cold, and I felt like seemed like rubber between my legs around my junk. It was very strange to me since a lot of people who report abductions report sperm and eggs being taken for breeding programs. The next morning, I went to let the dog out in the backyard, which is very small. To the left of the patio, there was a solid white ring in the grass that was maybe 8 to 10 feet wide. I showed my mother and she had told me that she heard a noise that woke her up that night before, but she dismissed it. Another extremely confusing experience I had occurred in my driveway in Tuscaloosa. To give you an idea of where this occurred, look up Shelton State Community College. The house was less than a quarter mile from the campus in the Inglewood neighborhood. It was nighttime, and I heard this static that I could compare to a jet. I looked over, and directly above the community college was a light blue slit in the sky. I would say it was maybe 200 yards long, completely vertical, and had what looked like white electric currents coming out from both sides of it. I looked at it, and maybe about 25 white things shot out at the slit toward the left one at a time, at a quick pace leaving the trail behind, and I previously talked about the streak. After they passed, the bottom of the slit went upward until the slit closed. It made a strange sound, and then it was gone. I've also had a bunch of experiences with orbs, some solid lit that float across the sky or move in strange patterns, and some that brighten up to a great intensity then fade as they pass. After that first big experience, I started doing some research because I was confused. I understand that I have an abnormally large amount of experiences, and honestly, can't tell you why. I wish I could. I found a type of UFO witnesses called a contactee. These people are similar to abductees except they are kept up with. I have no idea why I had so many experiences, and I've only listed a fraction of them. My best guess would be that, since I acknowledged the presence of whatever it was seeing, it decided to keep up with me. It's kind of a gift and a curse. There are so few people that I can talk with about it and be taken seriously. I want to seek hypnotherapy to see if there might be anything else I could uncover. I'm grateful, but still don't know much about my experience. If y'all can get anything out of what I shared, then great.